And welcome. Our top focus at this hour. On Friday, the International Criminal Court announced an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. The warrant against the Russian president is based on the war crime accusation of unlawfully deporting Ukrainian children. The Hague-based court said it had also issued a warrant against Maria Vovabilova, who is Russia's presidential commissioner for children's rights. Now, according to Kyiv, more than 16,000 Ukrainian children have been deported to Russia since the invasion began. The International Criminal Court said judges found there were reasonable grounds to suspect Putin's criminal responsibility. The president of the International Criminal Court said the execution of the warrants depends on international cooperation.
This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
The arrest warrant for Putin, a sitting head of state or the permanent member of United Nations Security Council, is an unprecedented step for the Hague-based court. The International Criminal Court is a court of last resort for the world's worst crimes when countries cannot or will not prosecute suspects. Moscow dismissed the orders as null and void. Russia is not a party to the International Criminal Court, so it was unclear if or how Putin could ever end up in the dock.
Ну а теперь Владимир Путин будет опасаться ездить в страны, которые признают решение этого суда и физически могут?
Нет, это я сказал, что мне нечего добавить по этой теме. Вот это, что мы хотели бы сказать.
War-battered Ukraine welcomed the announcement. The Ukrainian prosecutor general said Putin will now be afraid to travel outside of Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky dubbed the decision historic.
Сьогодні маємо вагоме рішення міжнародної юстиції у справі, в якій є реальна перспектива. Міжнародний кримінальний суд видав ордер на арешт Путіна. Історичне рішення, з якого почнеться історична відповідальність. Керівник держави-терориста і ще одна посадова особа Росії офіційно стали підозрюваними у воєнному злочині, у депортації українських дітей, незаконному переміщенні тисяч наших дітей на територію держави-терориста.
The President of the United States, Joe Biden, said the warrant was justified and makes a very strong point. He noted the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court.
I think it's justified, but the question is, it's not recognized internationally by us either. But I think it makes a very strong point.
EU Foreign Policy Chief called the issuing of an arrest warrant for Putin an important decision for international justice. British Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab also welcomed the move.
We have always made clear at the European Union that those responsible for the illegal aggression against Ukraine must be brought to justice. And this International Criminal Court issue is just the start in the process of accountability and holding Russia and its leader to account for the crimes and atrocities they are committing in Ukraine.
Russia denies allegations of war crimes by its troops. Experts have said it is unlikely it would ever hand over any suspects. And for more on this, we are now being joined by Jamil and Jafar. He is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. Jamil is also an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program. Jamil, welcome to WION. Russia has lashed out at these summons by the ICC. The Kremlin calls it meaningless. What do you make of the ICC's war crimes against Russia case and the reaction by Russian officials?
Well, obviously, this is just one potential charge that can be brought against Vladimir Putin and the Russian government for their behavior in Ukraine. We've seen all of the war crimes that have been conducted over a year now that Russia invaded Ukraine, including things like direct attacks on civilians, rape, and torture. And so the forcible transfer of children out of Ukraine into Russia obviously is illegal. It's a war crime under international law. But there have been a range of war crimes committed by Russia. This is just the beginning. It was the right thing for the ICC to make these charges. Unfortunately, I think the Russians may be right that it is likely to have a small effect, because to actually bring Vladimir Putin to justice will be a very difficult proposition.
Let's stick to that, Jamil. How likely is that Putin will end up at the ICC?
Well, unfortunately, it's highly unlikely, and that's in part because Vladimir Putin is likely to stay resident in Russia. To the extent he travels, he won't go to any one of these 123 nations that are members of the ICC. There are a number of members, as you correctly pointed out, a number of nations, I should say, that are not members of the ICC, including countries like Russia, China, and the United States.
Jamil, does the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, have jurisdiction in Ukraine?
Well, you know, that's a difficult question. They have the ability to bring charges about things that happen in Ukraine. Russia, at least as against Russia, Russia doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC because they aren't members. The United States signed the International Criminal Court statute, the Rome Treaty, but ultimately never ratified it, and ultimately withdrew from it back in the early 2000s. So there are a number of states like Russia and the United States that are not part of the ICC. But at the end of the day, they bring charges on something on a regular basis as needed when these type of things happen. They can't always enforce them. That is one of the challenges the ICC faces.
Well, Jamil, the accusations leveled by the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, towards Putin and Maria Vovabilova are pretty serious, despite Western nations and Ukraine welcoming the move. What do you think this latest case will do to the war? Will it have an impact, especially for Russia?
Well, you know, it's hard to know whether it have an impact on the day-to-day conflict of the war. It seems fairly unlikely. Certainly, it does highlight for the world, once again, the atrocious behavior of the Russian forces in Russia, their behavior in deporting these children, their behavior in using forced rape, violence against civilians across the board. For over a year, we've seen thousands of civilians killed, civilian infrastructure targeted. This is exactly why we have all of these laws of war to control and to regulate this type of behavior. The Russians have violated those with reckless abandon, and yet the world community has not all rallied to the support of the Ukrainians. You look at what China has done, refusing to call it an invasion. President Xi is going to Russia just next week to meet with Vladimir Putin, and you know, they're talking about trying to find a way to peace. Obviously, that is not China's intent. They're there to support Russia, and that's unfortunate in these circumstances, obviously.
All right, we'll have to leave that discussion there. Been talking to the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute, and also an assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program. Jamil, as always, thank you for talking to WION today.
Thanks for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.